Definition of the immovable property is not given. The definition of the movable property is not given under any of the laws. For practical purposes, if we talk about movable property, the vehicles, cars, scooters, furniture, computers, cash, jewelry, stocks, shares, books, clothes, etc., anything which can be moved from one place to another is generally considered as movable property. Immovable property would be something which is fixed to the earth, cannot be moved without damages. If there is a dispute between the parties related to movable property and immovable property, where would you file that case? Do you know that Indian law treats a mango tree and its fruit very differently when it comes to property dispute? The nature of property decides the kind of defense that you need to take when a case is filed. The nature of the property further defines the kind of case that you need to file to recover that property. So in today's video, we are going to understand the nature of a property and how it is so important for your day-to-day life transactions. Because in our country, not even a single person can remain immune to the property-related transactions. So as per law, there are two types of properties which are defined. First is movable property, second is the immovable property. And to understand the definition, we need to know three types of laws. First would be the General Clauses Act 1897, which defines movable property. Section 3 of the Transfer of Properties Act 1882, which defines immovable property, which also refers to Registration Act, Indian Stamps Act. However, when we talk about the immovable property, the definition of the immovable property is not given. Interestingly, all these laws were drafted by English people, and till today in 2025, all these laws are still applicable. Section 3 of the TPA, that is Transfer of Property Act, it does not define immovable property. It only says that immovable property includes land, benefits arising from land, for example, rent, easement, and things permanently attached to the earth. It may be included like buildings and trees and so on. On the other hand, General Clauses Act 1897, Section 3, it defines immovable property as a land, benefits arising from land, and things permanently fastened to land. On the other hand, Section 2 of the Registration Act 1908, it defines movable property and it only says the property not classified as immovable property, which includes goods, vehicles, machinery, stocks, debts, intellectual property, unless it is permanently attached to land. And at the same time, General Clauses Act 1897, Section 3 says that movable property covers all the property except immovable property. So in gist, the definition of the immovable property is not given. The definition of the movable property is not given under any of the laws. For practical purposes, if we talk about movable property, the vehicles, cars, scooters, furniture, computers, cash, jewelry, stocks, shares, books, clothes, etc., anything which can be moved from one place to another is generally considered as movable property. While immovable property examples would include buildings, trees which are rooted in the ground, right of the way, that is easement or leasehold interest in the land in certain contexts, all these are included under the definition of the immovable property. The legal distinction can be understood in such a manner when I talked about the mango tree example. So if there are mangoes on a tree, then it would be considered as immovable property. But once you pluck those mangoes, the mangoes would become movable property and the tree would remain an immovable property. Machinery, if it is permanently embedded in earth, it is immovable. If it is detachable, it may be considered as an movable property. For understanding purpose, let's jot down the differences between immovable property and the movable property. Immovable property would be something which is fixed to the earth, cannot be moved without damages. Movable property would be something which can be moved without altering its nature. For example, immovable property, land, building, trees, except standing timber, hereditary offices. Movable property would be vehicles, furniture, jewelry, patents, crops, once harvested, all right? So the crops, if they are there in the land itself, it would be considered as immovable. As far as transfer is concerned, the immovable property requires a written and registered document if the value of that property is more than 100 rupees. And that is given under Section 54 of the Transfer of Properties Act and Registration Act. While if you want to transfer the movable property, no such registration is needed unless specified. For example, if you want to sell your motor vehicle, then the registration would be done through the local RTO office. So as far as the stamp duty is concerned, when you sell the immovable property, the stamp duty is mandatory, and the amount of or the percentage of the stamp duty, which actually varies from state to state. While if we transfer movable property from one person to another, the stamp duty is generally not applicable until or unless it is specified under the state laws. As far as the taxation is concerned, the immovable property is always subject to property tax, capital gains tax, while the movable property sale and the purchase is generally subject to GST and income tax if sold for profit. Now, if somebody has to mortgage the property or give the property to somebody else, in that situation, immovable property can only be mortgaged, which is given under Section 58 of the Transfer of Property Act, and it also requires registration. While the movable property generally transfers is governed by Indian Contracts Act, and there is no registration which is required. Transfer or the possession of the immovable property. Transfer of possession alone does not transfer the ownership. That means if you want to transfer the ownership of the property, then registration of the document of change of title or the sale deed, that has to be registered. Now, if there is any dispute between the parties related to the immovable property, then the law which is applicable would be Specific Relief Act for recovery of possession or damages or injunction or so on and so forth. While on the other hand, if we talk about the dispute related to movable property, in that situation, since it is a contractual agreement, then the remedy would be for the breach of the contract which is executed between the parties. The contract can be oral or in written. Now, if we talk about again the distinction, I have already told you for sale and transfer of the immovable property, a registered deed is required. For movable property, it is not. Now, there is a very important question. Let's say if there is a dispute between the parties related to movable property and immovable property, where would you file that case? Now, if it is related to the suit which is related to an immovable property, in that situation, the suit can only be filed in the jurisdiction or in the court where the property is located. So, if the property is in the Karnataka, you cannot file the suit related to that property in Delhi. But if the suit is related to or the case is related to movable property, in that situation, there are like three jurisdictional courts. First, where the defendant resides or carries on his business. Second, where the property exists. And the third, where the cause of action actually arose. So at all three places, the case or the suit related to the movable property can be filed. If you have any questions related to this topic, you can ask me in the comment section. And if my videos bring some value to your life, then you can subscribe to this channel and you can share these videos with others also.